Dave, let's jump into some cases, starting with one at Yosemite National Park. Tell me about this guy. He's 20 years old.
Yeah, and he fits the profile of two other cases I've written about out of Yosemite, where the profile of this person is they're young, college, brilliant, described as others as brilliant, a huge future, pre-med student, this one. His name was Dikran Kanajian. Disappeared July 24, 72. You will not find anything out there about this, hardly at all. And I dug deep to get this because I knew the parks would not supply anything. And during a Freedom of Information Act request on communications about Dikran, there was a flyer, like a cable that came through from Ethiopia to our State Department, and that's how I originally got onto this. Anyhow, he was a student, a pre-med student at Cambridge University. He was born in Ethiopia, and he was born into a family that were watchmakers, and they were in the diamond industry. Well, he was vacationing in the U.S., planning on going to Florida, but first he was going to stop in Yosemite, and he checked into Curry Village, and it's this little tent camp that's in the base of Yosemite, and he was staying in cabin 486. And he checked in, and he was within a mass of people. These tents are right next to each other. It's like a little homeowners community. And you rent a tent for a few nights. Well, he went there, dropped his luggage in his tent, and he went back to the front desk, this area that kind of manages all these tents, and he asked them for directions to Half Dome. And that's one of the largest pieces of granite in the world. And the person said, oh, yeah, all you have to do is walk through this paved path, and it'll take you right there. So he was last seen heading in that direction. Well, on July 31st, he was supposed to check out, and the maids went in, and they found his luggage sitting on the floor, just like someone had left it, and the bed never slept in. So they called the National Park Service police, and they started doing an investigation. And they found out that somebody at that front desk had given him direction days earlier where to go, but they didn't find anything. They didn't even know really where to search other than the path between where his tent was and Half Dome. But they put some posters up. And really, that's all they ever did. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Park Service may not give any reports out anymore from Yosemite, because maybe they are embarrassed. I don't know. It's just conjecture, but a lot of people think this. Now, Dikran's dad, his name was Vartkus, and he was the owner of a company called Bacchus and Strauss, still around. It's the oldest diamond company in the world, and it's known for making these super high-end watches. Well, his father went to the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and asked for assistance in finding his son. And the U.S. said, okay, well, let us send some cables, and that's how I found it. And they sent some messages to some jails around the area and some hospitals. They didn't find him, that he was in any of these locations. Well, the father felt that he wasn't getting the ultimate cooperation, so he contacted President Nixon via the Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia and asked them on a friend-to-friend basis to help him. This is getting pretty high profile. And then he also went out and contacted Governor Reagan and asked him if he could help. And Reagan said, well, this is federal jurisdiction, but I'll see what I can do. And in the end, they weren't getting anywhere. He hired a private investigator and tried to find something, and they found nothing. Well, make a long story short, I had some contacts in the diamond industry, and I asked them if they knew Vartkus, and they did, but he had died. But his son was also named Vartkus, and his son, that's still alive and running their business, would have been 2 years younger than Dikran. And I was put in contact with Vartkus, and we had this email exchange back and forth. And he said, David, nobody cares. And he said, just the other day, I put a request in through the National Park Service for a file so I could kind of see what had been done with my brother's disappearance. And I was denied. And he said, I appealed it, and nobody would even respond to the appeal. And he says, now, I live in London, and he says, I feel like somebody in the United States, such as yourself, should have more power to get something out of your government than me, but seeing as my family's a victim, they won't even help me. He's completely lost. And I can't tell you how many times I've spoken with families that have the exact same feeling. In the beginning, that first 7 to 10 days, there's a lot of effort, there's a lot of show, there's a lot of press, there's a lot of searchers. But at the end of that 7 to 10-day cycle, that's it. There's nothing more. There's no other searches. There's no other work done. That's the end of the story. And unless somebody stumbles across a body or bones, nothing else is going to be done. And the reason I picked this case to talk about is I've also written about 2 other college students that disappeared, were never found, that were staying in the park in the same sort of area that Dickerin was, and they were never found. And in those instances, the parents happened to hear about each other accidentally from a reporter, and they made a request on President Eisenhower at the time to send in mountain troops to help search the valley floor because they weren't getting any assistance. Now, this is the only place in the world where I know of where 3 college students described as brilliant disappeared in a congested area of the park, supposedly, never went off a paved trail, and were never found. One of the things that came out in the last couple years is medical professionals that disappeared, and that could be paramedics, nurses, physical therapists, and it seems like they are disappearing at a higher percentage than the normal population. In conjunction with, German physicists, there were several cases of people high up in religious organizations that disappeared under these same profile points. And in this instance, Dr. John Marshall, a lot of people ask me, well, are there ever people from the armed forces that have disappeared? And this is probably about as close as you can. He was a 49-year-old retired lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Marines, and he was head of general surgery at the Spokane VA. This case mimics cases I wrote about in Missing 411, A Sobering Coincidence. In that book, I focused in on the same profile points, but where people were found in water. And this is a unique subset in that when men disappear and are later found in water deceased, 99.9% of all men will be found face down in the water, and women will be found face up. There are a very, very small number of men whose bodies are found face up. Why? They can't figure it out. A large percentage of those, they couldn't figure out the cause of death on the people that were found in the water. On the face, it looks like it's drowning, but it wasn't drowning in the end. Now, in this case, John was a super good guy. Every morning, he would get up at 5 a.m., drive his car to downtown Spokane, to the YMCA, and then leave his things in a locker and go take a run in the city every morning. He was religious about it. He was in great shape. On the morning of July 25th, 2015, he left his wife, who was also a physician, and their 2 kids in a rural house. He drove down to the YMCA, got there at about 5:30. At 5:33 a.m., they have him on camera walking out the door to take a run, and he's in his running attire. It's the last time he was ever seen alive. Well, when he didn't return to the YMCA and he didn't make it to the VA for his scheduled operations, his wife was called by the other physicians saying, "Hey, where's John?" His wife went down to the YMCA, and they said, "Well, we saw him leave, and here's his locker." Well, in the locker were his keys, his wallet, and everything, and his car's still outside. She calls the police. That morning in Spokane, there was a heavy, heavy fog all over the city. It was wet, and it was raining, freezing rain, and it kept the Spokane helicopter out of the air to search. So they had just ground teams looking all over the city for John. And they looked everywhere. And there's a big river that flows right through the middle of Spokane. And they thought, well, maybe somehow, we don't know how, he might have fallen in the river because there was no place else to look. And they searched the river and walked it all the way up and down through the city, never found anything. Now, he disappears on January 25th. On January 26th at 8:58 a.m., downriver, they find, somebody calls in and says there's a body face up in this river. They go down and they find it. It's John Marshall. And he's found just below these rapids that are about 15 feet high that come down, and there's a predominant place where it settles, and this is where he was found. Now, they pull his body out of the water, and in his left front pocket is an iPod. And unbelievably, the iPod is completely dry. And the detectives couldn't find a point where his body could have entered the water, meaning he slipped down an embankment, fell over a railing, any witnesses, nothing. Well, they knew he had to go over the rapids, so as they pull him out, they and the coroner start looking for vegetation that should be on the body because it tumbled down these falls. There was none. Now, the police are getting suspicious because they're not finding the things that should be relevant in this obvious drowning case. And they tell his wife, well, you're not sure what happened, but apparently he drowned. So it goes to the coroner, where the wife right away knows something's wrong because John's a great swimmer. He's a super athlete. He did, multiple tours in Afghanistan. He was a battlefield physician. He was like the optimum guy you'd want working on you and being your buddy. So the PI starts to look into this, and it starts to make press. And the PI said publicly he didn't believe John ever went into that water or went down those falls. The PI publicly said John had to have been placed in the water somewhere. Well, the coroner stated that the body was in the river for 27 hours, meaning that almost immediately when he walked out the door from the YMCA, he had to have gone in the river. Now, a detective in New York coined a statement that I'll use every time, and it's called local reports for local consumption. And that means that some people will say anything just to put this case out of sight and out of mind. Now, if the body was in a large flowing river for 27 hours, there is no way in hell that iPod could have been dry. The coroner's verdict was accidental drowning. The PI believes Marshall was murdered. Now, I wrote an entire book about cases identical to Dr. John Marshall's, and I called the PI on this. And he was a retired sheriff's deputy, really smart guy. He goes, Dave, there's no way this guy fell in the river, and there's no way he rolled down that river all the way through the city. And why his body is face up, I'll never know. And I said, okay, John, and I explained to him, these dozens and dozens of cases that have occurred just like this that nobody can explain. And he says, wow. And he was blown away. And to the point was, it took a while, but I got all the cases from Spokane and all of the photos. Everything supports what the PI said. And I got to give it to Spokane police, and specifically the detective on this case. He told the wife, he said, I don't know what happened here, and I'm not even going to pretend that I do understand, because this is one of the most confusing cases I've ever seen in my life, and I don't think he jumped into the river, and it doesn't appear we can find an area where he fell into the river. So how he got in, how he died, why he died, I don't know. A lot of times, many times, on these cases where it appears it's an accidental death, cops don't get really intrigued by that, and it's real easy to just rubber stamp it. And years ago, when really these cases first started to show up, there was a detective in New York that was working missing persons. And he started to realize that bodies were showing up in the rivers around New York in places where, supposedly the guy was missing in one part of the city, and he shows up in a river in the other part of the city, but that would have been completely upstream from where he disappeared, so it didn't make any sense. And then the biggest thing that this guy discovered, and I discovered in all the cases I investigated, is that the time that the person was missing, say he disappears on a Friday and he's found on a Tuesday, that body doesn't show 4 days in water. It shows just a small amount of time in water, which means where was the person for those 3 or 4 days? In my thoughts, and in the thoughts of the coroners that do second autopsies on these cases, they were alive for the vast majority of that time, and then they died within a short period of time from where they were found.
Was there a second autopsy?
Well, the second autopsies are super expensive. They can be like $2,000 to $3,000. And I don't know why John's wife didn't ask for a second autopsy, because she was highly suspicious of the whole entire process. But one thing is that in the second autopsies, they found GHB in a lot of these bodies, and that's a date rape drug. Now, there's no implication about how these people got the GHB in the super high levels in their bodies that were found. And in the instances where the coroners ruled that they did drown, if you think about it, a date rape drug is where it makes you almost comatose, where you realize what's happening, but you can't move. So imagine if you had high levels of GHB, you were placed in the water, you might drown. You would drown because your body can't fight back. One of the things I identified in past books was the disappearance of physicists. And a specific German physicist disappeared in California hiking on a rural trail while he was on a retreat, visiting from Germany. He was at a conference. Well, while I was digging around, I came up with a guy who was 61 years old, disappeared April 1st, 2007 in Coconino County in Arizona. His name was Reinhard Kirchner, and a brilliant German physicist. And he had a residence about 1,000 feet from the Rhine River, worked for a company called GSI, and they operated an accelerator that dealt in heavy ions. He was single. He liked to travel, and he was headed to British Columbia, where he flew into, picked up a camper truck and rented it, and planned to meet his girlfriend in your town in Las Vegas a couple weeks into his trip. Well, he left Germany, picked up the camper truck in British Columbia, and then drove it down into the States. And they backtracked, and they found that at one point he was registered at the Staircase Escalante National Monument for 2 nights. He then spoke to his girlfriend in Germany, told her he was in Page, Arizona. And they planned to meet when she flew into Vegas on April 9th. Well, Reinhardt never met her. She went to a hotel, waited, and then called the sheriff in Page, Arizona, reporting him as missing. Well, on April 12th, the sheriff's got a call from the Navajo police stating that they had an abandoned camper truck near the edge of the Little Colorado River Gorge on State Route 64. Well, the sheriff arrived, found the doors to this camper truck locked, and they ran the plate, and it comes back associated with a missing person, Reinhardt. Well, they called the owners in Vancouver, and they said, yeah, he had it rented for this period of time. It was reported missing, blah, blah, blah. So the sheriff calls in some search and rescue people, and they start searching the area. Well, the girlfriend told the sheriff that Reinhardt had been to that specific area before where they found the truck, but she didn't know why he went there. And it was determined that the only thing he took with him that day was a camera and a day pack, nothing else. Well, because this is near a national park, the Navajo police, and the sheriff searched the area with helicopters, planes, ground teams, dogs. They found no scent, found no trail, they found nothing. Well, it turns out that the gorge is really close to where it was parked. It's just across the highway from the truck. And in the gorge, there were 3 different teams from U.S. Fish and Wildlife that were doing fish studies in that river. So they went and interviewed him, and they said, no, we never saw anybody come down the cliffs, down into the gorge, nothing. But about the time the search was starting to get going, there were wind gusts up to 50 miles an hour that restricted the use of their helicopter. And the camper that they found that was Reinhardt's was treated like a crime scene, and I got those pictures. And there was food in the refrigerator. It looked just like a camper truck that I would use if I was going to travel cross country. There was nothing unusual about it per se. But they found his notebook with the last entry in it of March 31st. And they figured that the truck had been at that location since April 1st. Now, one of the reports written that I got was written by a guy named Lieutenant Mark Christian. And he wrote in his report about an interview he had with a local resident that drove up to the truck on April 1st because it was an odd place to park, and this local just wanted to make sure everything was okay. Well, this local had taken photos of the truck and given them to the sheriff. And the sheriff happened to ask the witness what he thought might have happened here because it's so strange they've never had a truck parked out here in the middle of nowhere. And the witness stated, and he noted in his report, that the locals had talked that Reinhardt had been taken by aliens. There was also a note in the report that at about the time Reinhardt went missing, a silver object was seen in the sky by the truck by the locals. So in this case, what's so bizarre to me is that they bring dogs into an area that doesn't have a lot of population, a lot of scent of other things, of other people, and they can't pick up any tracks and they can't pick up any scent. They talk to the people in the bottom of the gorge that just happen to be there, and they don't see anybody coming down into the gorge. Where's Reinhardt? I have an open mind about this stuff, but imagine that this is the second German physicist that disappeared in the middle of nowhere. What are the odds?
There's another case, Charles Ulrich.
You talk about one of the most mundane guys in the world, 63 years old, January 29th, 1975, Ulrichsville, Ohio. It's about 50 miles south of Akron. And he lives essentially right next to a big river. And he was employed by the state of Ohio Employment Services in New Philadelphia. His wife worked for the hospital in New Philadelphia. And they lived in this rural house, and there were no neighbors close by. Described as extremely healthy and extremely religious. He was a Sunday school teacher and a church elder. And his wife, Dorothy, and he lived on the outskirts of the city along County Road 39. He was a father of two kids, and one of his sons was a professor at Purdue, so they had good genetics. Friends said Charles was one of the most stable and honest people you could ever meet, and he was extremely into his routine. And his wife told investigators that every morning he wakes up at 6 a.m. He makes coffee for both of them. He shaves, he dresses, and then he wakes his wife right at 6:55 each day. And they go into a room and they both watch a religious show for 5 minutes and then another show until 7:30. And Charles then would take a path from their yard kind of through this woody area to Highway 36 and catch a ride with a fellow Mason member. Well, on January 29th, 1975, it was like no other morning. And Dorothy's alarm goes off at 7 a.m. Well, she never heard Charles get out of bed. And he didn't wake her that morning. And it was weird that she hadn't heard him get up, and she hadn't even thought or felt him not wake her because she was so much into a routine. She said for some reason she slept through all of this. And she searched the house, and she found the front door open a couple inches, but no Charles. And he hadn't made the coffee, and she determined that when he left the home, he left without his keys, his wallet, his belt, and his shoes. And a lot of the cases I write about, the victims are found with no shoes. And shoes I've talked about this a lot. The one thing that we wear every day that we really never clean, but also what carries the most bacteria on our body are the shoes. And that's been the one consistent thing in talking to a lot of people, the shoe issue. And Dorothy called a neighbor to help her search, and then they couldn't find him, and they called the sheriff at 8:45. Now, the morning that Charles vanished, there were heavy thunderstorms right over their house. And she told authorities that Charles had a cough, and he had the flu the morning he disappeared, but he was better. He was getting better, and he said he was going to go to work. There were several massive searches. They found nothing. Now, the morning he disappeared, deputies reported several screams at a nearby strip mine gravel pit. They searched it. They found nothing, but they thought it was weird that the same morning he disappears, within a mile and a half, they have these calls at this pit. And I wrote about several cases in Sobering Coincidence that these gravel pits were found bodies. Now, this is the strangest thing. I've never heard of this. Second major incident, shortly after Charles vanishes, Dorothy, his wife, buys a German Shepherd for protection. Well, one day she returns home from the hospital, and she finds the dog tangled in electrical cords, and it has a broken neck. And she called the police about it because she thought it was so odd that this dog could break its own neck getting all tangled in these electrical cords. But Charles was declared legally dead in 1980. There's a couple things about this case that to me are bizarre. No shoes on when he leaves the house. That's odd. How did Dorothy sleep through Charles leaving and sleep through those thunderstorms? Odd. Why would he walk out of the house with his pants, but no wallet, money, belt, or keys, or shoes. And he was listed in perfect health 2 weeks before the disappearance. He had just seen his doctor, no dementia, no Alzheimer's. And then it's an amazing coincidence that this dog has its neck broken in the weeks following. I don't even know if a dog could break its neck that way.
What are we to make of these, Dave?
It almost appears as though people travel distance to get someplace to die. Years ago, I remember watching a movie where a series of people all left this city and went to a specific location, and they all met each other, and they couldn't figure out why they were in this specific location. And in some of these cases, the people do things so far out of character that it doesn't make any logical sense at all. And like you said, it's almost as though they're in some kind of zombie state that they've got to get somewhere. They probably don't know why, and they do things that don't make any sense that we'd normally never do.
You've got updated all the charts of the cases and broken it down into some categories, and it kind of jumps out at me. You break it down by victim age and by sex pretty clearly. 2-year-old, 3-year-old through 10-year-old. The biggest cluster of all are kids. That whatever is doing this focuses on kids first in those age group 2 to 10, and then there's another spike in the early 20s, 20 to 23.
So when I first came up with this, I went to a geneticist and I said, what could you tell me about the difference between somebody's DNA at 2 years old versus somebody's DNA at 40 years old? And they said, when you're early in life, your genes and your DNA are so pure that they haven't been altered in any way, and they haven't had illness, injury. They haven't been altered to the point that they would be at 40. So when you're 2 years old, you've got some optimum genetics. But as you get older, alterations start to happen to your DNA. Not that the DNA changes, but you have things that you wouldn't have at an earlier age. Say cancers develop, things develop where you wouldn't have it at that pure state. And that's the only thing I could ever grasp myself, why those younger groups stand out versus the older groups.
We're talking about this U.S. Navy blimp. It's patrolling off the coast of California, and the blimp comes back, crashes on land. The crew is gone. Dave, pick up the story from there.
So the Navy did their investigation, and they said that there was no fire on board. When it hit the beach, originally when it hit land, it dropped one of its bombs accidentally. That made the blimp lighter. It was able to take off again and crash in that Daly City neighborhood. There was a massive search off the coast that went on for days, and they never found anything. They reviewed radio logs. There was no call for help. They could never explain why the blimp went straight up into the clouds after dropping the flares, and they thought that it would have stayed lower to watch the slick that they were watching on the water. There was lots of watercraft in that area. They never found the crew or the emergency survival equipment that they were wearing. And this is an area outside the Golden Gate that I've written about many times before, because just north of San Francisco, you have Point Reyes National Park, which has had several strange disappearances I've documented. And just south of the Golden Gate to a location called Half Moon Bay in that area of the coast, I've written about other disappearances that are very, very strange. No other part of the Northern California coast north of that Point Reyes area, and nothing immediately south of Half Moon Bay. So it's this one area that has this strangeness attached to it. They came up with some explanations that, to me, that were laughable. Or even if they'd come out of their life jackets, they would have recovered the jackets.
Right.
Because the area, the water that was searched out there was searched so thoroughly. And eventually, those jackets are going to wash up to shore, and they would have recovered them on the beach. So these explanations absolutely made no sense at all.
You have another case from Scotland.
Sure. December 24th, 1975, 9:30, occurred on the island of Mull. It's an island in Scotland. He's 55 years old. Gibbs was a war hero. He was an intellect, and he was a pilot. He flew Spitfires in the Battle of Britain in 1940. He was staying at a place called the Glen Forsa Hotel, and it sat right on the ocean, northeast side of the island of Mull, and there was a grass airstrip there. And the rooms were right next to the airfield looking at the water. He arrived at the hotel on December 20th. On December 23rd, he contacted the owner of a Cessna 150 parked at the airstrip and asked if he could fly it. Ian Hamilton was the attorney, negotiated a price to fly the two-seater. And on Christmas Eve, 1975 at 9:30, Gibbs walked out to the plane with a hotel guest named Felicity Granger. And she thought she was going to go with him on a flight, but he told her no. She had to lay out the torches so he could fly and land. So she exits the plane, places the torches out in the field, and she sees him taking off in the plane flying out over the water. Now, some reports say that after he took off, they saw strange lights on the water. Some people said it might have been a fishing boat, but they could never identify the boat, and they could never see where the lights went. Well, make a long story short, Gibbs didn't return on the plane. And there was a major search on and off the island for days, and they found nothing. And they found sheep herders and ranchers that searched all their property. They got nothing. Well, on April 21st, 1976, this is about 4 months after the disappearance, Gibbs's body is found on a knoll, and this isn't a mountain, it's like a knoll near the airfield. And he has a small scratch on his chin, nothing else. And a shepherd took part in the original search, and he walked by the spot where the body was found multiple times and never saw it. Now, if Gibbs had jumped from the airplane, there should have been more injuries and broken bones, and they never found the plane. Nothing physically was wrong with him, so he could have walked back to the hotel, the best everyone could tell. The coroner stated the cause of death was exposure, meaning hypothermia, and he guessed that he probably died 2 hours after takeoff. Well, they examined his clothing, and there was no salt or marine organisms on the body. That means he didn't go into the ocean and crawl out. Unanswered questions what were the lights on the water? Really, how did he get there? Really, how long had he been dead? Where was the plane? And in my notes on this, I write down GHB again, because there's no reason for a man to die of exposure on the top of a mountain. When people get cold, they get up and they walk. You don't lay down and die. Obviously, the top of a mountain is colder than the bottom, or where you could see humanity from the top of this mountain. Strange case. I look for cases that are insurmountable, meaning that explanation doesn't fit. I have several cases where somebody leaves a house, and within 100 yards of the house, they find a pile of clothes. And the person left the house, and it was 70 degrees. Well, yeah, later that night, it got down to 50. But the person left the house, and in 100 yards, all their clothes is gone, and they're in a stack in this field. This has happened multiple times. Also, I've had other cases where a parent says, my baby couldn't take off their clothes. So if somebody's saying they removed their clothes and they died of hypothermia, good luck with that, because the kid couldn't take off their clothes. So the cases I try to include, I try to explain this rationally. Well, I've written of cases where special notes were made that the clothing and the body was impeccably clean, like it just came out of a laundromat and the body just came out of a shower. And they couldn't explain why everything was so clean. Well, the same thing applies to the water-related cases. When a body's in water, it does certain things that we know, certain things to the hair, loss of hair, wrinkling of body, fingernails, things like that. And when these bodies are pulled out, coroners have made statements that, well, the person disappeared on Monday, but they've only been in the water for 24 hours, but they've been gone for 6 days. So where have they been for all this time? And that's the importance behind finding a body, especially in water, because it shows things that it wouldn't show otherwise. One of the questions I get all the time is, are these people ever found to be abused, sexually abused, things missing from the body? That's not the case. If they are found, they're found pretty much intact without a lot of injury to them. I mean, one of the things that people have said a lot is that, well, Dave, what they're doing is they're taking the soul. When we first started this trip together years ago, people said, oh, he knows what it is. It's
Right.
got to be something mundane. It's maybe some crypto topic that he just doesn't want to talk about. But we've come a long ways. And I think if you start shutting the door too early, you can't see really what may be obvious years later. And that's one of the reasons I've been reluctant to say anything that, may be a possibility, because it may close that door for me. I mean, thinking where we are today versus where I was 6 years ago, it's
right.
a huge distance. I wrote about a case in Michigan several years ago, and they tracked this guy's phone all over this area. And according to the pings and according to where it hit, he would have had to have crossed a road multiple times in this pattern that he was supposedly tracked in. And there was never any evidence he was in any of these areas, and he was found deceased in an area probably where he should have been and where they were originally looking. The pings didn't make any sense. This happens probably more often than you hear. And everyone kind of just sloughs it off and says, well, maybe it's just the technology, we don't know, maybe it's not that good. There's some reason we're getting these pings in these areas. And it's disconcerting that they happen because it not only throws off the search, there's never an adequate explanation as to how it got there.
You have some cases where kids are taken, they're very young, and their explanations are pretty weird, so no one takes them seriously about, I was taken away by the big talking bear or something along those lines, right?
Yeah, those are hard to explain. And, a lot of people, a reporter will put in the article, oh, that's just a kid's imagination, the searcher said. Well, is it or is it not? Well, yeah, I wrote a story in my last book of a Spanish priest in Texas that was running from Native Americans and came upon this giant piece of pink granite in Texas. It's a state park. And he said that as he ran up to the top of the granite, it opened up and swallowed him. And he said that he was inside this boulder, he guesstimated, for 3 days. And then he said at the end of the third day, it spit him out. And that isn't the only story I've got like that. And people probably don't know this, but there's stories out of Iceland that they will move a road when they're building it before they will blow up a piece of granite or a big boulder, because they have a belief in their society that things are living inside of those boulders.
David, we're talking about the little case of Jared, who was out there, stumbled across a couple of fishermen. He was playing around with the water, and the fishermen didn't like that. What happened to him?
So search went on for weeks, and in the middle of the second week, his dad, Alan, got a call, and this person said he was from the inside of the sheriff's office, and he said, you're not getting told the whole truth. They're withholding information from you, and I hope someday you'll learn the truth. And the guy hung up.
Wow.
Well, 4 years later, and about 700 feet above this trail, some people were hiking, and they found some clothing that they thought was Jared's. So they call search and rescue back in, and the sheriff's office goes in there, and they find a skull cap, and they find one tooth sitting on top of a log. And the clothing, his pants were inside out. The jacket he was wearing was laying on the ground, and he was wearing two shoes, and both those shoes were sitting on a boulder in the same vicinity. Now, George, what's interesting about this is that the shoes looked brand new.
4 years later.
Yeah. In 4 Colorado winters at about 9,500 feet, the vibrancy of the colors in the shoe were very high. So they took the clothing and they sent it to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and they didn't find one drop of blood on any of the clothing. And originally, the sheriff came out and gave a press release when they found the clothing and said, oh, he got attacked by a mountain lion and died. And the press threw it all over. And I've gotten a lot of heat from people who never read the book or the facts saying, why are you publicizing this? Because it was just a mountain lion killing. There's no way it was a mountain lion killing, because 4 experts that we have have all looked at the evidence and said there's no way a mountain lion killed that boy. And Alan explained one of the key parts to this is that when Jared walked around, he never, ever tied his shoes. He didn't know how to, and he never wanted them tied. And if Jared was carried up the mountain and drug up that mountain, there's no way his shoes were going to make it up there. Now, myself and my son went up to that mountain, went to the point where he was found, and I can tell you it's about a 70-75% incline through some of the roughest, rugged, boulder-laden cliffs you can imagine. And to think that anything was able to drag Jared there, I don't believe it.
Is it preposterous, David, to come up with a scenario that maybe these people are being beamed aboard like Travis Walton was in his case?
You know, I've had that told to me probably hundreds of times. And Travis and I are friends on Facebook, and I respect him a lot. And there's some of these scenarios that explanation would fit part of it. But then again, it doesn't fit all of it. And that is probably the perplexing part of these disappearances, is that it's hard to find one scenario that maybe fits all of it. I wrote a couple of books, and I started to see physicist missing. And then all of a sudden I said, you know what? I'm going to start looking to see if they include occupations or academics on these things. And in one of the first books I wrote, there were two men missing from Yosemite 3 months apart. And these really, really caught my attention. There was a young man named Orver von Loss, and he was a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley. And another man named Walter Gordon, graduate student, UC Berkeley. Both disappeared the same year, 3 months apart, in the same area on the valley area of Yosemite. They were both walking in areas that would baffle you why or how they disappeared. Each said they were going for a short walk. Neither guy knew each other. They were in different majors. One was an economist and one was, I don't remember, but both were described by their friends inside of Cal as brilliant, absolutely phenomenally smart. Now, neither one of these were ever found. And I talk about these clustering effects of missing people, not just in geographical context, but also in time and space. And the weird part about Von Loss and Gordon is that there wasn't a lot written about them in 1954. And I don't know if that was purposeful or not, but their families pushed so hard. They wrote to the president at the time, and they asked the president to send in special forces because they knew that their sons were taken. And they said, there's no way our sons would have walked away on their own. So we need help. And their request was denied. I made a request through the Eisenhower Library, and I actually got a letter that they wrote, and it's touching. They really wanted help, and they were ignored.
And nothing. Why? Why are they ignored?
Why wouldn't they give this up?
You would think so.
According to the law, they're supposed to. And there's cases I've asked about out of Yosemite under the Freedom of Information Act, and I've been told by the special agent in the Park Service that I will never get that case. And I asked them, is it a criminal case? They said no. They said it's just a missing person case. I said, has anybody touched the case in 12 years? No. Are there any suspects? No. I said, well, but I've gotten 30 other cases from other parks across the U.S. that are missing persons cases. Well, yeah, you might have gotten those, but you're never getting this. I said, well, what's the reason? Yep, no need to know. You're not getting it. That's their attitude sometimes. Now, I should preface this by saying that the frontline park ranger that you meet in the park and that person wearing the Smokey the Bear hat, those are the salt-of-the-earth kind of people. They are really, really dedicated. And we've met a lot of them, and they were all some of the best people we've ever met in our lives. And I would hold zero animosity towards them. And when you talk to them, they feel that, I can't say all of them, but the ones I've interviewed all have the same feeling about the administration. They're stymied in their efforts to find information sometimes. There's a couple of National Park Service rangers that have a website that they thought there was improprieties going on regarding their budget inside of a park. They filed the Freedom of Information Act against their own service to get budget information, and they were eventually eliminated from the Park Service because of their inquiry. This information restrictions that are being placed by the Park Service are coming from people at the highest levels of the administration. These aren't rank and file people making bad decisions. These are the upper administration people saying, you're never going to get this. Namely, I wanted a list of missing people inside the National Park Service. They have a group, and I've been told there's 600 people approximately that are law enforcement officers within the Park Service. Now, that's a pretty large contingent of federally trained law enforcement personnel that carry guns.
Sure is.
Some are special agent status that are detectives. You cannot convince me or any other journalist that this group of people is not going to track missing people in their system. I love the national parks. I go all the time. But there's a couple things I don't do anymore. I don't ever go alone. I don't ever go on a hike in a national park without a personal locator transponder. I don't ever go without carrying my gun. And if I am going, I'm always going to let somebody know where I'm going
That's
in,
smart.
when I'm coming out. And if I don't, you come and get me.
Have there ever been reports of more than one person being taken at the same time?
Very rare, but there have been times. It almost seems as though the victims in these cases are people that are taken by opportunity. You know, first in line, not in sight, last in line, not in sight, alone, separated from others. A lot of times it's a hunter that gets separated from his hunting partners, and he'll say, I don't even know if they're on radio together. I don't know where I'm at, and I don't know if I'm going to find my way out tonight, so I'm just going to stay here, and then they never see him again. So it's almost like an opportunity issue, and when we talk about the intellects that have disappeared, it's always they're alone for some reason when they disappear.
Do you think that they're being stalked or tracked before they disappear?
You know, and we've had talks about this as a team, that it would almost appear that when the opportunity presented itself, even if it's just minutes, sometimes seconds, then the person is gone and they're not found. I think I'd be foolish to say that, no, that's not the case, because there are times where I do think that is the case.
Geographically, David, is there a specific area that gets more of these disappearing cases?
Well, let me talk about an area that doesn't get any disappearances, and that's right down north to south, right in the middle of the United States. And another location that almost has nothing but is surrounded by clusters is Nevada. There's one or two inside of Nevada, but on the whole, when you look at the map, there's this dearth of nothing. Now, when I was a policeman, we would put up pin maps tracking serial robbers or serial rapists.
Right.
And one of the things they don't do is they never do something real close to home. They'll do it away from home. Usually the first time is closest to their house, but it's not very close. But then they'll spread out in a pattern, almost a circular pattern from where they live to do their crime. And I've had other law enforcement guys say, Dave, it looks like the middle of Nevada is where whatever's doing this is living, because obviously there's nothing there. I mean, it's very strange, but all the way up the West Coast, there's an entire series of disappearances, and people have reminded me that it kind of follows a path of volcanic activity all the way up through British Columbia. And then coming down through Montana, Idaho, and the Rocky Mountains, going all the way down into southern Arizona, there's clusters. Again, one of the things that's predominant in these cases is relative location to water or mountains, namely completely surrounding the Great Lakes, all along the Appalachian Trail within hundreds of miles of the Atlantic Ocean, and then right on the Pacific Ocean.
What are the possibilities that there's a sick organization out there that is doing this almost as if it's an initiation? Go ahead and get somebody.
Well, again, you have to remember that a lot of these people, small kids, have disappeared on rural trails in parks and forests. And I know for a fact that some of the best tracking bloodhounds and canines have brought into those areas and they've utterly failed. As somebody who's worked with dogs for almost my entire career, I know that those dogs live for that job. And for me to believe that time after time those dogs are failing, I don't believe it. And so I don't think that it's possible that a human could be taking somebody down a trail from the point they were last seen and the dogs wouldn't pick up on it. Or trackers, some of the best Indian trackers in the world have gone into these areas and have failed. And I know that if there had been somebody walking out, they would have tracked them. It's happening with more and more frequency. In the last 3 years, there's been an escalation in these type of disappearances.
David, this case of a hunter found in the mountains in Montana.
Aaron Hedges, 38, he went missing elk hunting September 7th, 2014. They searched for him long and hard, and he was one of those guys that got separated from his partners. And it was in an area of Park County, just kind of northeast of Bozeman. And they didn't find him. Well, 6 months later, they find his boots and some other items that it wasn't real clear, but they didn't find him. There was a massive search of the area. Then another 3 or 4 months later, they find his orange vest, his backpack, and some other items in another area. And anyone who has been hunting knows that you're not going to be taking your boots off, and you're not going to be removing your backpack because it's kind of your lifeline to your food and your protection. So the whole thing is very strange, and I think it's concerning to the people there because they found these strange items in areas that doesn't make any sense. But, once you read these stories, you'll understand that this isn't uncommon. And I'm talking about in sometimes warm environments, you're going to find that people have completely stripped themselves of clothes, and it's an impossibility that it's in a hypothermia situation because they haven't been out in the environment long enough to develop the hypothermia. And I get reminded of that a lot, except when you're talking about environments where it's warm or the person couldn't have been gone long enough to develop the situation that is alleged.
Are there some similarities here that you can tie together?
More often than not, they're going to be missing clothing or their shoes or both. If they come back alive and they can speak, almost more times than not, they don't have a memory. And if they do have a memory, they tell strange stories. Sometimes they'll say that people have been following them in the woods. I know that sounds weird, but that's what they'll say. And, push them for a description, and they really can't give any. Sometimes if they're found deceased, they're found very close to a river, creek that's dry, and it would almost appear that it would be impossible for them to get from the location where they disappeared to the location where they were found. And they are found sometimes without shoes, without boots. Classic case, a physician named James McGrogan. He's from Indiana. He disappeared just outside of Vail, Colorado. He was with a group of friends, and they were backpacking up, and they were going to stay in an area high above Vail, and they had split skis with them and backpacks. Dr. McGrogan got ahead of the group. He disappeared. He was missing for almost 2 or 3 months. He's found 6 air miles east of where he was last seen in an area that would have been essentially impossible to get to. He's found with his skis on his back. He's found in a dry creek bed, dead from a head wound. Apparently he fell, and he had a helmet on. But the strange thing that wasn't in any newspaper reports, wasn't in any police reports, it only appeared in the coroner's report, is that when they found him, he didn't have his boots on. We interviewed the people at the sports shop where he rented everything. He had enough supplies that if he was lost, to put his tent up that was in his backpack and camp for 2 weeks and survive anything. He had an avalanche warning device. He had everything.
Why is it happening to these people?
Well, if you go back to the intellect side of the fence where we talked about earlier, scholars and intellects have vanished. I put McGrogan in that highly, highly smart man, young man, ran marathons, brilliant emergency room physician. He fits with that very, very smart person that wouldn't make those mistakes that he made. And I actually feel really, really bad for his family because I don't think they're aware of anything we're talking about here because it doesn't get mainstream coverage. What can we do?
Do you think some of the people in the park systems know what's happening?
So the higher-ups, the top-level administrators are not idiots. I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but you can read the data that I've laid out, and you can see that there is something highly, highly unusual and coincidental in case after case, 1,600 of them, that all seem to follow the same patterns. And people on a big trail disappear, and they're never found. That, to me, seems impossible.
What about this case of this Arizona woman?
The title of it was Las Cruces Woman Abducted on Arizona Camping Trip. Again, if you look at all of the cases I have, that word abduction and kidnapping will come up when they come up with nothing at the scene.
Exactly.
And there's no shoes, there's no sweaters, there's no backpack. They eventually have to say they were kidnapped or they were abducted because there's nothing else left. Now, this woman falls into this category that I've been talking to you about, extreme disability. Partially blind, suffers from short-term memory loss. They were 4 miles southeast of the Chiricahua National Monument. But why that's important to me is, first of all, there's a cluster of missing people in this area. That monument is the only National Park Service location in the U.S. that I can figure out where an on-duty National Park Service ranger disappeared and was never found. His name was Paul Fugate. And now this woman disappears 4 miles from there. She was with her mom. Mom was going to use the restroom. She said she was just going to walk back to her car. It's in a pretty big camp area. A lot of people around. Nobody hears anything. Nobody sees anything. Canines can't track anything. They don't find her shoes. Again, this happened in a place called Rustler Park. This woman just vanished.
David, what was that case we were talking about yesterday where a little boy disappeared?
June of '69, Dennis was 6 years old. He's with his dad, his grandpa, his brother, and they were in an area called Spence Field. They hiked into it for Father's Day weekend. They were in this field playing, and a family walks up to the Martins, and this is all a series of coincidences, and I'm telling you, it's strange. So the Martin family's there playing around. Another family walks up and says, "Hey, can our boys play together?" Mr. Martin says, "Sure." And they introduce themselves. "Oh, my name's so-and-so Martin." Mr. Martin looks at him and goes, "Our last name is Martin." Now, from this point on, I've been reminded many times that, well, maybe the abduction scenario was for one of their family members, not Dennis. Now, Dennis had a slight learning disability. He was 6 years old. They're playing hide and seek. Dennis goes and hides behind a tree. Mr. Martin was a super smart guy. He was an architect. He watched his son walk behind the tree. He told me he never took his eyes off the tree. When everybody said 30, 40 seconds later, "Okay, everybody come out," Dennis never came out. Mr. Martin got up out of his chair, walked right over to the tree. His son was gone. Right adjacent to that tree, within feet, was the Appalachian Trail. He told me he took off on a dead run down the trail for 2 miles. He came back, found nothing, told his dad, "Go back and go down the hill and get rangers." His dad took off. Within hours after Dennis disappeared, it started to rain, and it rained solidly for 7 days. I forgot how much the guesstimate was, like 6 to 8 inches, an enormous amount.
Jeez.
Now, as this is going on, immediately as it's happening, there's a family 2 miles away, downhill in the valley, that are asking a ranger where they can go to see a bear. Rangers sent them up this area called Rowan's Creek. Now, this family's last name is Key, K-E-Y, the Key family. Another coincidence, because this is the key to the whole case in my mind. The Key family walks up this valley. They slowly get separated from each other, and a father and 2 sons are far up the valley looking up a hill, and the 12-year-old boy tells his dad, "Hey, look, there's a bear up there running around." His dad says, "No, son, that's not a bear. That looks like a man, but they're hiding behind trees." And just before they make the observation, they hear the loudest, sickening scream they described that they'd ever heard. So they see this thing running behind trees. Now, they don't know a boy disappeared. They don't know anything's happened. They come back. They eventually go home. And next day in the front page of the Knoxville Times is this story about Dennis Martin and that he disappeared, and he disappeared up on Spence Field. Well, Mr. Key says, I don't know if it's related, but I should call. So they were told that an FBI agent was monitoring the cases at the park. So they call the FBI, and they volunteer to go down and show the agent where this happened. They get a call back, and the agent and an officer from the Park Service says, no, don't come to the park, we'll come to you. Doesn't make any sense, because if I'm the investigator, I want to know where you were at exactly and what you saw. So the Key family never goes to the park. The Martin family had an agreement with the Park Service that anything of any evidentiary value, Mr. Martin would be told. He never left the park for 6 weeks. Now, weeks later, Mr. Martin gets told about this from a newspaper reporter. Mr. Martin goes livid, but the Park Service tells him, don't worry about it, because the timeline doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. And it's impossible for your son to get from point to point in that region. Dwight McCarter is the head tracker for the Park Service at the time, and we went out and interviewed him. And McCarter told us that he knew when he heard that was a lie. And he took Mr. Martin by the hand and said, hey, let's go right now. We're going to walk this and see if we can do it. And they did it in the time frame that it was alleged. And they went to that exact location. Mr. Martin was even more upset at this point. Now, who told everyone that this was impossible was the FBI agent. Now, George, I got a file that's 3 inches thick on this case from the Park Service. Nowhere in any of the documents does it talk about the Key family, their observations, what they saw, nothing, nowhere. Now, how I found out about it was that the Knoxville Times wrote a series of articles, and they wrote about this. But they left a few key things out. Now, I went and I spoke with Mr. Martin, and he has never moved from the location where he lived when Dennis disappeared. And myself and another researcher went up, knocked on the front door, came to the front door. I explained who I was, and I said, Mr. Martin, I doubt there's anybody in the world that knows more about this case than you and me. I just want to ask you a few quick questions. And he says, Dave, I spent my whole life trying to put this behind me, and I promised my wife I wouldn't talk to anybody. And at the time I came from California, he said, I traveled all the way from California just to talk to you. Just give me 15 minutes. And he said, sure. And he stepped out onto the front porch. George, I've talked to a lot of victims and the victims' parents in my life.
You've seen it all. You've seen it.
That one conversation changed me because I was shook. We both had tears in our eyes when we left because this man was totally lied to consistently by everybody in the investigation. I started to talk to him, and I asked him a series of questions, explain to me what happened when Dennis disappeared. He did. I asked him about the Key family observation, and he said, well, Dave, you do know a lot about this, huh? And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, do you know something about that observation that wasn't in the paper and wasn't in any reports, but they saw something that wasn't included? Do you know what that was? I said, no. He said, well, they saw something that looked to be Harry running around on the side of that hill. And something was on that thing's shoulder at the time. I said, so you mean you're implying it was carrying something? He said, yeah. He said, the Key family told us that and told the investigators and told the reporter, but nobody would put that in the newspaper. Nobody would put it in a report. I said, is there something else I ought to know that happened that nobody else knows about? He says, yeah. He says, apparently you wrote about all the stories of the disappearances in this area over the previous 30 years. I said, yeah, I have. And he says, it's the same FBI agent each time? I said, yeah, I've named him in every report. He says, do you know what happened to that agent? I said, I have no idea. We've tried looking for him. He goes, he committed suicide.
My God.
Well, I went back to McCarter, the tracker. I told him everything Mr. Martin told me. I said, is that true? McCarter said, it's all true. I said, then what did they see on the mountain? And McCarter told me that there's a series of quote-unquote wild men, people like you and me that live off the grid, that have furs on their shoulders, and that live up there.
Bigfoot?
He says wild men, and his quote was people like you and me that just live off the grid. He goes, it's my opinion that Dennis was abducted. And I said, then why weren't they able to find him or track him? He says, well, that's a good question. And I said, well, there was even a Green Beret regiment that was brought in and searched alone. They wouldn't talk to anybody. They searched without search and rescue personnel and without Park Service assistance, and they had their own communication system. I said, even they couldn't find this thing. He says, yeah, you're right.
This unbelievable case in Idaho pops up with this missing 2-year-old little boy.
A 2-year-old boy named Dior Kuntz on a Friday, July 10th, 2015, about 2 p.m. He's in Lemhi County, Idaho, near a city called Leodore. And they're at a reservoir, and they got Grandma and Grandpa there, and they got Mom and Dad, and they got their little boy. And Mom and Dad are going to go take a walk, and Grandma and Grandpa are watching the little boy. And I'll quote the grandma, "We turned our back, and seconds later, he vanished." And that was her words. He just vanished. I always say this when I'm talking to a group. Kids always will walk away. That's just the way they are. But they're not going to get a long ways away. And, you're going to yell for the kid. They're going to respond back. The best parent, there's going to be a time where accidentally you take your eyes off your child for a few seconds. And in this incident, that's just what happened, and he disappeared. Now, near the campsite, there was a small creek, not a big one. And then where the creek came out of was a reservoir, and this reservoir is surrounded by big, steep mountains. And the sheriff went in with a team and divers, and they walked the creek shoulder to shoulder. They dove the creek. He said with 100% accuracy, the boy is not in the creek.
And he also said he has never seen anything like this ever in his career.
That's right. And so the search is still ongoing to this day. And they have no leads. The canines haven't picked up a scent. Like you said, the sheriff is just dumbfounded about where this boy might be. And the parents and the grandparents have started to talk that maybe the child was abducted or kidnapped. And as I state in my books, this is a common way to go when all of a sudden you're faced with reality that the child is not there right now. Where are they? Now, in a high percentage of these exact cases, the child is found in one or two places. They are going to be found in the water, or they're going to be found high up in altitude in an area that I can guarantee where they're not going right now.
And they're going to be found dead.
That's right. And unfortunately, that is the reality of the profile that we've established. And I can tell you that there isn't a search and rescue crew, 95 or 99% of them, that have ever heard of what I'm telling you right now, because they work off a profile that, say, 90%, 95% of the time, a boy of this size is going to walk downhill, take the path of least resistance. But there was a case, and there's several, but I'll talk of just one. Now, this incident with Dior happened July 10th. Incident I'm going to tell you about happened July 13th, but in 1957 in the Eastern Sierra, and it's in a little area called Mono Village. And it's outside of Bridgeport. It's on the eastern side of the Sierra, just east of Hoover Wilderness, just outside the borders of Yosemite National Park.
Okay.
A family goes there camping. There's two lakes in a small valley with super steep sides to the valley, and it's a box valley where there's one way in and one way out, just like Dior's incident. What happened was his husband and wife step out of the camper. They see their son. He's about 100 yards from the camper. They're looking at him. They go back in the camper for seconds. They come back out. He's not there. And they search. They call the sheriff. Within days, they're convinced, and they say this, that their boy is kidnapped. They said there's no way he could have gotten out of this valley. The sheriff put up roadblocks on all the highways. They were searching cars. They were convinced this kid got kidnapped. Well, on July 16th, they bring in the Marines from a high-altitude training center that they have in the Sierras, and they explain to them where the search has been at, where the boy is not at, and now they have to exhaust every other opportunity. And I actually commend the sheriff's department in this area, Mono County, for doing what they did, because nobody would even think to do it because it's so ridiculous. So the Marines start searching, and right near where the boy disappeared, there's a switchback trail going right up the side of this super steep granite-laden mountain with no foliage on it. It's just a switchback going up 1,500, 1,800 feet. And the Marines start going up it. And they get to the top, and they go down the other side, and they said, well, there's nothing here, but we're going to keep going up the other side. They go up 3,000 feet, and a sergeant named O'Brien steps around behind a large boulder, and he sees David Scott, 2 years old, 3,000 feet above the valley, naked, except for one sock face down on the floor dead. Now, The sergeant was asked by a group of press people if there were any visible injuries to his body, and he stated at the time that he wasn't an expert and he can't make an opinion like that. But every survival person I know of that's read that story has said there is no way a 2-year-old is going to make it up the side of that mountain.
It's impossible.
And the other part about that story is that as you're going up the switchback of these trails, everybody from the valley could see you as you're going up, and you could turn around and see below. So the idea that no one saw this boy, or even with somebody else going up the side of that mountain, seems pretty ludicrous. And they never found his clothing. In the articles that I researched for that, there was never any indication of abuse. There was never any indication that the sheriff pointed fingers at the parents. The parents were grief-stricken. There was a lot of support. And in subsequent articles after that, the unusual thing was I never could find a report on an autopsy or coroner's statement about what the cause of death was or how the boy died.
In some cases, somebody who is in line with other people as they walk through the forests or the parks, the last person seems to be the one who gets it all the time.
And, that's something that it took us a while to figure out. And there's an individual named Roger Marsh who works for MUFON who wrote an article about that specific fact that I wrote about in one of my books. And you would think, if you're kind of that knee-jerk person, that just happens, blah, blah, blah. But it happens more frequently than you realize. And a young man, 20 years old, was in Chilliwack, British Columbia. And he was hiking with a group of friends up to a reservoir. And they were all together. And what is common in these is that the group will say, we somehow got separated. They don't say that somebody went somewhere. Or they would say that this friend of theirs, his last name was Sagu, was a little bit ahead of him. But then they said all of a sudden he was gone, and we don't quite understand how it happened, but he wasn't there. They immediately called search and rescue. Chilliwack Search and Rescue responded. RCMP responded, and there was a big search. And 3 days later, they brought a helicopter in, and as the helicopter's flying into the area, not even flying on a specific path to look for him yet, they're in another part of the park, and they're in an area that has a boulder field. And if you look online, Chilliwack, British Columbia, missing man found, you're going to see a picture of a boulder field that isn't very steep, but it's a big boulder field. And in the middle of the boulder field, they find this guy dead. And many, many times, these victims are found in the middle or around boulders. And I'll read you a quote of what the search and rescue people said. They said, "It's just difficult to get lost in this area. It's such a well-marked, well-worn trail with lots of hikers on it, so it's very strange that nobody had seen this individual." Then on where the body was found, it was very, very strange and difficult to explain why he ended up where he did, said Fraser, adding that the boulder field is quite a bit above elevation of the lake and a fair distance from the trail. And when you look at the interview with this search and rescue guy, he is absolutely perplexed. And I should say that in all of these cases, there's nobody that's going to come out and say, "Oh yeah, this is pretty normal stuff." But when you read the stories and how consistent the same storyline is time after time after time, you start to see this word coincidence so many times that almost anyone who's a survival expert says there's too many coincidences here. Well, one of the things that I get from people who haven't read the book is that, just like you said earlier, maybe there's a serial killer on the trails, and it's happened before, and maybe it's happening now. But after you get into the minutia, the data, you realize that we've mapped 52 clusters of missing people in North America, all matching the same profile point that you'll learn about. And of those clusters, the biggest cluster in the world is Yosemite National Park. Part of people's thinking is that, well, maybe it's an animal attack. And that's a natural place where we'd all go. Every case in the books has been vetted for that, meaning that search and rescue people have eliminated that possibility. Trackers that come in, they would see drag marks, they would see blood, they would see hair. People in the area that were hiking with you would hear screams and yells. There's never anything like that. There's no scene, there's no blood, there's no hair, there's nothing like that. So that's been eliminated. If you were going to take an adult person in the middle of nowhere and drag them away or carry them, that's a very, very hard thing to do. And you're not going to carry them very far. And when canines come in, they're going to still be able to track your scent, and trackers are going to be able to see you walking out of that scene. So a serial killer in the woods in 52 places in the U.S., at the frequency that this is happening, that really doesn't hold any water. Animal attacks doesn't hold any water. So those are the two primary things I hear about on a regular basis. Third thing is voluntary disappearance. If the person has a mental illness, we won't work that case. If there's any indication of a voluntary disappearance, we'll step away. So suicide, just trying to drop out of society, which people can if they want to, no, it won't fit into what we're doing.
Right.
So those are the big primary ones that search and rescue look at all the time. Now, on the weirdness factor, I mean, I've heard everything in the world, and most of the stuff I don't know much about, and people have written me thesis-length emails explaining why they are passionate about why they think the way they do, and I never discount anything. I always will read it. I'll say that's interesting, but if there's something on its face that doesn't make sense, I'll throw that in. One of the things that somebody brought up just the other day was, there's stories about these giant birds that sometimes come into an area. I mean, really giant, like prehistoric birds.
Thunderbirds.
Yeah. And there's a possibility maybe they would pick up a small child and carry him away. And the issue I have with only that one is that if the child is found, I think there would be evidence of talon grab or...
They would have pecked him to death.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And none of that has ever come across anything I've seen. As I tell everybody in front of every conference I've ever been at, we are the most open-minded people you'll meet. And I'm probably a mile wide and an inch deep. I don't know a lot about many big things, but I know a lot about a little, just because listeners and experts in different fields have read the books and they've sent me their thoughts. Some of them are, I don't know, and others are, well, maybe, and I've never put a stamp on anything yet, and the reason for that is that I believe as a researcher you have one opportunity to get it right, and if I make a gigantic claim and later it turns out I'm 100% wrong, well, my credibility's kind of lost. And I have to look in the face of victims' families, and if they see that I'm behind some story that just is bizarre and makes no sense to them, it's hard to meet them, look at them, and hold integrity and credibility.
Tell us the case of Kenny Veach.
Well, I'll tell you what, that case is one of the most unusual because there's actually a YouTube of Kenny going to a cave, looking in it, and trying to determine what he saw and what happened to him. And this is in an area where there aren't a lot of disappearances that I've written about. This is in an area in the Sheep Mountains in Nevada. But from where he disappeared, if you look out the valley, there is a story that I did in CBS Las Vegas on their news channel about a boy who disappeared within eyeshot of where Kenny Veach disappeared. Kenny was 47 years old, disappeared November 10th, 2014, and he liked to put up YouTube videos, and they were good, and I thought they were really interesting because he'd take you into a desert landscape and talk about it, and I actually learned a lot. And one of these times he went into this area, and he came out, and what he said was, when I went into this cave, it made my whole body vibrate. And he said, it's the strangest cave I've ever experienced. And he got out of there. He was alone. Scared him bad. And again, if you go online, search his name, V-E-A-C-H, Kenny, you'll find the video. And he explained that this cave is kind of shaped like a big M as in Mary. And he left, and he thought about it for a few weeks, and he came back, and he was carrying a gun, and he said, I'm going to try to find this cave. Well, during that effort to find the cave, he disappeared. And near one cave's entrance, they found his cell phone outside the cave. Now, to a lot of people, that might not mean a lot. To me, it does, because the victims that disappear, 99% of the time, never disappear with their cell phone, a GPS device, or a firearm. Now, they found this phone in an area where they weren't sure if that was the cave he was talking about or not. They did send a remote viewer camera down into the cave, and they said he wasn't inside. But the idea about that it made him shake, vibrate, and it gave him an uncomfortable feeling, so much so that he left, is intriguing to me. And when you listen to him, you could hear that the guy was scared. And there was a big search. They searched every cave in that area. It was weird. I can think of a couple times in my life where I have been seriously afraid for my life, and I actually started to shake. Could have been nerves, could have been something else. I don't know. I say this too, and I think it's important to be said, is that I am not pointing a finger at search and rescue and law enforcement and saying they did an inferior job and they missed that person, because I don't think that person was there when they were looking, especially the times where they say that they were walking that trail every day and they never found him. The 10th day they walked the trail out in this one case, and a tree is laying down across the trail, and this little boy is laying deceased on top of the tree. First of all, the coincidence of a tree blocking the trail, almost like telling the searchers, hey, you're not going to get past this point because you're not going to miss this.
Right. And here he is.
And here he is. Earlier this year, I was going to Rhode Island to watch my son play a playoff hockey game, and a medical examiner that I'd been communicating with from the East Coast from a very, very large jurisdiction had contacted me earlier in the year, said that she had read the books, and said, we got to talk, we got to meet. So we met in Rhode Island. And she said, Dave, you are into something here that medical examiners that do a lot of cases know what's going on. They know this is occurring, they don't know why it's occurring, and they can't explain it. And part of these cases, George, that I profiled in the book, a large percentage of those incidents, the coroners can't determine the cause of death. I mean, normally in society, especially when I was a policeman, I've never heard of that. Now, in my conversations with this coroner, they stated that in the old days, there was a lot of political pressure to clear a case and offer an explanation to the community so that there would be acceptance. And as time is going on, they stated that there still is that pressure, whether it's subliminal or overt in certain places, but how strong that medical examiner is to stand up and say, hey, I'm not an idiot, but I can't figure it out, and say that straight up. Or do they say, the person died of hypothermia, which is one of those kind of murky things that there are some things with the stomach and marks that they can find, but sometimes they really can't. And so a lot of times on those older cases, I'll read, well, the person or the child died of hypothermia. I read that all the time in old cases. Nowadays, I'm reading more and more where they can't determine the cause of death, even of the adults.
Of the amount of people that disappear, what % are found dead?
So these are the ones that fit this profile that we've established. And we're not talking about everybody who disappears in the woods. There's just these unique disappearances. We've documented about 1,500 right now, 1,600. I would say that probably 60 to 75% are deceased. And those...
They find the body.
I should say deceased, or you don't find them. But that's not to say they're ever going to be found, because, I mean, there's cases that you and I talk about where people are found 4 or 5 years later, and the strangeness factor doesn't leave. The finding of the remains even offers more ambiguity to the entire situation. But in those cases where somebody is found, there isn't always answers either, because the high percentage of those that are found, this is another factor and a profile point, is that these are people that have severe disability, dementia, autism, a speaking impediment where they can't communicate, etc. And those people come back, and a high percentage of time, they come back alive, but they can't tell you what happened.
So you do have a percentage of people who come back alive. What is generally the time frame that they have been missing?
That's a big variable. And they've had some young boys, say 7 to 10, come back after 8 or 9 days, and searchers are just completely dumbfounded that the person could have lived that amount of time in the area they were at. Many of the times they're in an area where there's a lot of mosquitoes, and the physician will make a comment like, wow, no mosquito bites, and the person doesn't have a sunburn, but they don't have a lot of clothing on. They've lost almost all their clothing. There's a couple of, there's more than that. There's probably 10 cases out of Canada that are exactly that profile, where somebody was smart enough to write it down in the report that this doesn't make sense.
In a lot of cases, the clothes seems to be taken.
The clothes or the shoes or both, and the majority of the time they're never found. Sometimes the weirdness factor goes up. They're found folded on a rock or a boulder. Sometimes the shoes, I would say a large percentage of the time, the shoes are never found. Other times the shoes are found in areas that don't make any sense. There's a case, you just briefly touched on it before the break, involving Jared Atadero in northern Colorado. He disappeared in October of '99, a 3-year-old boy. His family owned a resort up the Poudre River about 50 miles west of Fort Collins. Beautiful area. And the family was hosting a singles network of people that came in for the weekend. And Jared has a sister named Jocelyn that's a couple years older than him, and this group was going to go down the road not too far and visit a fish hatchery. And so they asked Alan, the dad, if they could take the kids up to the fish hatchery, and the kids wanted to go, and they thought it'd be fun. And so finally the dad said, okay, have fun, see you in a little bit. Well, somehow or another, something very strange happened, and this single group decided, after going to the fish hatchery, that they were going to go 20 miles further west into the wilderness and start hiking with these kids on a trail without even telling the parents. And this is part of the story in Colorado that is not being told to the public. And so they're walking the trail, and Jared, at 3 years old, gets ahead of the group that's watching him, out of sight. And he goes down the trail, and he walks up to 2 fishermen that are standing on the creek bank. And Jared's banging a stick in the water, and he asks the fisherman if there's any bear in the area. And the fisherman said, no, there's no bear here. And they said, stop knocking the stick in the water.
He's scaring away the fish.
Right. But, George, this boy is probably 1.5 miles into the Comanche Peak wilderness at this point. There's no adult around, and these guys let this kid just walk away. Yeah, sit down. You're not going anywhere. Just wait here for your parents or whatever. But he walks away. He was never seen alive again. And there was a huge search. They brought in a helicopter from the armed forces. That crashed. And one of the things I write about in my book is that there's 6 air-related crashes to the searches I've described in my books.
Astronomically high.
Very high. And so that aerial association I thought was really strange. But anyhow, the Larimer County Sheriff's Office did the search for Jared, even though it was in federal jurisdiction. He was on a place called the Big South Trail. And Alan and his brother and his family, they were there every day. And search and rescue wasn't finding anything.